Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, June 26th. We like to call Thursday here Friday Eve on the Mo News podcast. I'm Moshe Mamdani.
And I am Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. One of you was like, is your name Mo Shwenunu? I'm like, no, it's not Shwenunu, but I do kind of merge.
I've not heard that, actually.
I've merged my names on the podcast. Moshe Wanunu. I should pause between my first and last name.
Extra points for anyone listening who knows how to spell Moshe's last name. That's the really hard part.
You're just a Google away, unless you want to challenge yourself. Jill, I was a founding member of a fraternity chapter in college. And as a founding member, future pledge classes have to memorize the names, at least in our fraternity they did, of the founding fathers of said fraternity. And years later, I would be in a New York City bar and somehow I'd be talking to a group of younger guys. And they're like, wait a second. I know you. I was forced to memorize your name. I was like, oh my God, we're brothers. We're fraternity brothers. And then they spelled my name. Oinou. I just gave it away. They're like, we thought they made up the name because had so many vowels in it. We thought it was just a test. I was like, no, that is my real name. I have 6 vowels out of 8 letters in my last name. Fun story.
It may have been one of the harder things that they had to do in college, Moshe.
Well, pledging a fraternity, depending on your fraternity, depending on your college, might be one of the riskiest or hardest things you had to do. But yes, definitely memorizing like 25 guys. And,
what is that name?
What is that? Is that real?
Anyway, another jam-packed day of news.
Yeah, a lot going on this week, everybody.
I guess what else is new? So let's get to the headlines here. A political stunner, Zohran Mamdani, wins the Democratic primary in the New York City mayoral race. What does it mean for the future of the Democratic Party?
Fascinating fallout here. Of course, we mentioned it briefly at the top of the podcast yesterday, but more fallout here as a Democratic socialist is now set to be, well, depending on how things go in the fall, the next mayor of the largest city in the country. Donald Trump is chiming in. Democrats are chiming in. We'll tell you what we think it means on the pod today.
To the Middle East, President Trump says that U.S. and Iranian officials will hold talks next week. It comes as the ceasefire between Israel and Iran continues to hold.
And what the NATO Secretary General called Donald Trump yesterday. You won't believe this.
Moshe, just when you think you can't be shocked by anything, there is something shocking. To health news, we told you about how RFK Jr. fired the 17 members of a vaccine advisory committee. Well, that newly appointed committee is set to re-examine the childhood vaccine schedule. To Wall Street, Nvidia shares hit a record as the AI chipmaker once again becomes the world's most valuable company. A new trend, the West has stopped losing its religion. Literally, we'll go behind the numbers as more people are turning to religion. What's behind it? And Moshe, my fingers hurt just thinking about it. Apparently, Gen Z wants to bring back the Blackberry.
I have fond memories of the Blackberry BBM messaging. Gen Z, if you're curious about what it means and how it went, I spent many years with that keyboard. In fact, I waited a while for an iPhone because I couldn't imagine a phone without a keyboard.
Me too, Moshe. In fact, I was like, there's no way that device is ever going to last.
Well,
it's not going to happen.
You know who else felt that way? The head of Microsoft. We'll explain.
And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, on this day in history, famous JFK speech. But what he said isn't what he thought he was saying. Why he told a large German audience that he is a donut. I'll explain.
It's so not where I thought you were going. I thought you were going with maybe ask not what your country could do for you, but what you could do for your country. But okay, looking forward to it.
No, this was his attempt to translate a foreign language, and he said he was a donut. Some of you might know what I'm talking about.
All right, let's start with the fallout from that stunning upset in the race for New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, a 33-year-old Democratic socialist and state assemblyman from Queens, beat former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary. Mamdani has a lead of about 7% over Cuomo, with more than 90% of the vote counted. The official ranked choice voting results likely will not be announced until Tuesday, July 1st. But with his fate obvious, Cuomo not waiting until then. He already conceded the race. That happened Tuesday night, only about 90 minutes after the polls closed. So what's next? Mamdani will face off in the general election against current mayor Eric Adams. He sat out the primary. He's running as an independent and potentially several other candidates as well. But Mamdani is the heavy favorite. If he wins, he would be the youngest mayor of New York in a century. He would also be the city's first Muslim and Indian American mayor. And his win in the primary, making him the face of the new left, joining the ranks of AOC, Bernie Sanders. Mamdani, in his victory speech Tuesday night, promised to lift up the working class and serve as a model for the future of his party.
We have won because New Yorkers have stood up for a city they can afford. A city where they can do more than just struggle.
Mamdani ran on a platform of making buses free. He ran on free childcare. He's pledged to freeze rent on regulated units. He wants government-run supermarkets. He wants to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour. He's advocated in the past for defunding the police, but now he is calling for smaller budget cuts and the addition of a new community policing agency. He says he plans to pay for it all by increasing taxes on residents who make more than $1 million a year and also inflate the corporate tax from 7.25% to 11.5%. Now, a reality check on that last part, the state actually needs to sign off on the tax hike. And New York Governor Kathy Hochul has said it is not happening, saying, quote, "I do not want to lose any more people to Palm Beach." A reference to Florida, of course. She says, "We have lost enough." By the way, Moshe, I was watching CNBC on Wednesday, and they were interviewing real estate broker and reality TV star Ryan Serhant. He said he woke up on Wednesday to about 80 calls from people saying that they want to move to Florida.
Yes, a lot of fear as to what Mamdani promises, especially what it means to New Yorkers with a lot of money, particularly those in the real estate industry where he'd do a rent freeze too. It's not great for business. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has actually tweeted in recent days, come one, come all, New Yorkers. We've had a whole bunch of you come down in recent years, and we expect more of you to come down. So there's expectations in Florida that real estate prices are set to go up in Florida, with New Yorkers making their way down there. You mentioned the Kathy Hochul comment as well, the New York governor, saying we've already lost enough people down there. We are not increasing taxes further. Fun fact, folks, for those of you outside of New York City who are unfamiliar, in New York, if you're a resident of New York City, you pay federal income tax, you pay New York State income tax, and you pay New York City income tax. And he's talking about increasing the taxes in the city as well. So just after California, New York City residents are the most taxed folks in the country. And he's got a lot that he is promising here. And it's going to cost a lot of money, and he's got to pay for it somehow. And so he said, you know what? We got to tax corporations more. We got to tax the wealthy more. And people are like, yeah. And say the wealthy being like, I want to move to Florida. And so we'll see how real that is, honestly, Jill, because, you know, as you stated, reality check, he needs the state behind him on that. And Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, is like, absolutely not. I have my own race next year, and raising taxes is not something I am keen to do if I am looking to preserve myself and win re-election here in New York State. So there's already a lot of questions about the promises Mamdani is making here and what is actually going to be realistic. He does have a lot of control over the NYPD. He has a lot of control over, sort of rent control boards, stuff in the city itself. When it comes to taxes and some of that, not so much, but that does put a crimp in the various things that he's promising here. And so we'll see if that reality check impacts him in the fall as he faces a general election here. Jill, as you mentioned, you know, he has a general election. It could be a crowded field. He's got Eric Adams, who Democrats basically were like, get out of here with your federal corruption trial. So he didn't run as a Democrat. He's like, I'm going to run as an independent in the fall. So he's like, hey, everyone, I'm still around. Cuomo got knocked out. Come back to me. If you want me, you know, if you want us all to prevent this guy from getting in office. The Republicans have a perennial guy who always loses, named Curtis Sliwa. He's part of a group. They wear red berets. He's always saving cats. He gets about 20% most of the time. But, you know, then you have Andrew Cuomo, who's considering an independent run here, and he's going to look around. But ultimately, the more people to split up the sort of moderate to right flank of New York City, the more it clears the field for Mamdani to win the mayoral race. We have ranked choice voting in primaries, but not in the general. So he could become the mayor of New York with like 31 or 32 or 33% of the vote, depending on how many people get in there. So right now, the bet is that Mamdani is the next mayor of New York City. But we will see how the next 4.5 months go. And if they can consolidate, if everyone who's opposed to him can consolidate, around one candidate, we'll see who that is. But Eric Adams ain't getting out. And so will people come back to Eric Adams? Unclear. We're going to wait on polls here for all of that. Jill, beyond the tax thing, public safety certainly has come up as a concern here for a number of residents. You mentioned, he was once an advocate, not so long ago, like 4 years ago, of defund the police. Now he's like, I'm just going to cut the budget here and there. Let's not use the term defund. But ultimately, he's, wants to cut out certain units. He wants to cut out their protest unit. Adams, former NYPD officer, was partially elected in 2021 after a surge of crime post-COVID, and put a whole bunch of officers on the subway, et cetera. That's something Mamdani's been critical of. So there is a huge concern among folks that even if it's not the tax increase, that things could become unsafe again, because he is very much into social justice, and the feeling that various laws and increased traditional policing is racist and discriminatory in some ways, and what that'll mean. And I did put up on our Instagram feed warnings from people in San Francisco and Chicago, including the Chicago Tribune. The newspaper Chicago wrote an editorial ahead of the election. Hey, New York, you might want to avoid Zohran Mamdani because someone similar to him, Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, hasn't worked out from the perspective of the newspaper in Chicago. Jill, also interestingly, ahead of this election, it is very rare that the New York Post, conservative editorial page, and the New York Times, the liberal editorial page, agree on anything in life. The only thing they agreed on ahead of the election was, from their various perspectives, do not elect Mamdani. So that was very interesting. Mamdani defied the odds here against Andrew Cuomo, 3-term governor, son of a former governor in Mario Cuomo, establishment figure, the guy who held your hand during COVID, et cetera, et cetera. Cuomo, who had the backing of all major power brokers in the party, and Bill Clinton, and Mike Bloomberg, the former 3-term mayor of New York City, and an incredible money advantage, and the financial community, and the real estate community, and the New York Post, and the New York Times. Mamdani beat him. So it does say something about just where we're at.
All right, as for a little bit about his background, Mamdani was born and raised in Uganda. His mom is a filmmaker. His father is a post-colonial studies professor at Columbia University. The family moved to New York City when Mamdani was 7 years old, and he became a U.S. citizen in 2018. He was first elected to the New York State Assembly in 2020. He was also a rapper at one time for kicks. He also co-founded his college's first Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. He's been a vocal critic of Israel. He's long supported the BDS movement, that's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, to force companies and organizations to stop investing in any companies that do business with Israel or even associate with the country. He also refused to condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada, which many Jewish people and others interpret as a call for violence against them in Israel. Intifadas, or Palestinian uprisings that took place in the late 80s and early 2000s, killed more than 1,000 Israelis. He, though, insisting that the word intifada is peaceful. It's a peaceful call to resist Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. We mention this, of course, because New York City, home to the largest Jewish community outside of Israel. Moshe, again, an astounding victory for Mamdani. I asked Mohammed Yunus, he's formerly of Gallup, he's the current director of the Brunswick Group, his thoughts.
We love Mohammed Yunus. You were chatting with him yesterday?
I was, and I asked him what he made of it based on what he sees in terms of polling. And he said it is a sign that Americans are just fed up with the established wings of each party. He says over 6 in 10 Americans want there to be a third party, and he sees candidates like Mamdani as an expression of that sentiment, but on the left. Wall Street, by the way, no surprise, not happy. Hedge fund billionaire Dan Loeb writing on X, it is officially hot commie summer. Moshe, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, listen, one of the crazy things, New York City, the financial capital of the world, it is about to have a democratic socialist as man, the heart of capitalism. Alexander Hamilton created the first bank here 250 years ago. And we're going to have a socialist, democratic socialist. But he's cool with the label, and has as many critiques of capitalism. So it's fascinating. You mentioned there the kind of frustration with the establishment. Republicans have already had their sort of political insurrection, I should say, within the party. You saw the Tea Party movement, the early teens. You saw MAGA, basically Donald Trump blow up the entire party. Literally in the debate in 2015 was like taking down the Bush family and Jeb Bush when he was running there. So they already had their revolution within their party. And Democrats have watched Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Clintons, and every rally has Bruce Springsteen at it, and then the Obamas. And as far as they're concerned, it's not working out for them. They got blown out this cycle, right? Democrats don't control either part of Congress. They have a minority of the Supreme Court. They don't have the White House. Trump won the popular. They're not happy with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and even Hakeem Jeffries is relatively new, but they have this old wing that's running the party. And who did the establishment put in as your next mayor of New York? Andrew Cuomo. You know him. He was governor 3 times. He had to resign with the, scandal, sexual harassment scandal. And I think, I heard from people like they had a problem. A lot of people had a problem like voting for Cuomo. It was like, hold your nose and vote for Cuomo because the other guy, he is a socialist. They're like, no. And so I think that, there were definitely people blowing up Chuck Schumer's phone yesterday saying, Chuck, really, that was the best date you had? Like Andrew Cuomo, like no one else. That was our best bet to prevent this, guy. But what's wild here, Jill, is Mamdani, it was a big field, almost 12 people, 11 people, I should say. And he was at 1% in February. He went from 1% in early June. It was like, oh, this guy's sort of getting competitive. He'll probably, give Cuomo a run for his money, but Cuomo will still be the guy, to actually beating Cuomo. And not even like close. But 90 minutes in, Cuomo was like, yeah, we're not even going to wait till next week. Like, you definitely won this, right? This is an embarrassment. This was a surge. And I will say this as a New Yorker, between me and Alex, me and my wife, like we probably got 4 or 5 phone calls from the Mamdani campaign. I heard from no other candidates. They were calling everybody, right? Like, oh, have you considered supporting Zohran Mamdani? Even when I voted on Tuesday, you have to be a certain amount of feet away from a polling place. The only candidate that had somebody, Mamdani. I mean, he had this huge grassroots support and volunteers everywhere, and he dominated. He won white voters, he won Hispanic voters, he won Asian voters. Interestingly, black voters went to Cuomo, and he won anyone who made over $50,000 voted for Mamdani. Interestingly, if you made under 50, you voted for Cuomo, which speaks interestingly to, given that he's calling for free stuff and helping people with affordability, et cetera. Now, you make over 50, you voted for Mamdani. Probably if you made over several hundred thousand, you probably then voted for Cuomo again, based on the tax record. But there is this huge frustration out there, and there's questions as to what this means for the future of the Democratic Party. There's dozens and dozens of primaries happening next year where you got a bunch of young Democrats who want to knock out establishment leaders. So you're going to see this on the House side and the Senate side. You're going to see a lot of names, prominent names, potentially go down here. They're probably looking around being like, I got to make sure that I'm plugged in and in touch, and people don't view me as out of touch with what's going on, because you got a lot of angry Democrats. They're like, we want you to fight Donald Trump. We don't want you to concede anything here. And that's what Mamdani has offered to do, right? He has said, we will not cooperate with ICE raids in the city. I will fight with him. And, Cuomo made a point of saying, well, I got experience fighting with Donald Trump. And he's like, yeah, but like, I'm going to do it different. And I'm a new generational leader. So there is also a comparison here, and I mentioned it yesterday, to sort of Obama versus Hillary 08. Obama made a generational argument. Clinton was like, I'm a Clinton, and I've been here for a while, and I can get stuff done. And Obama's like, I'm new and different and interesting. And you do see some sort of comparisons, obviously very different federal context, different things, but you do see this whole, like, Cuomo was riding on his name, and he wanted to do no harm. And his job is to do as few interviews and as little campaigning as possible, because they saw the way that he resigned in disgrace several years ago as a vulnerability.
Right. He was trying to run a more safe campaign. And Moshe, as you mentioned on the podcast yesterday, we tried to interview him here on the Mo News podcast, and it just didn't work out.
Yeah, they kept saying, can you avoid talking about why he resigned from office? I'm like, are you kidding me? We're a news podcast. Like, yeah, the man doesn't have an answer for it. I've heard his answer for it. Like, he needs to address it. It is an issue that we kept hearing from people. And it was an issue that we saw the results of on Tuesday. But it spoke to the fact that they didn't want to take any risks. They didn't want to have to answer for stuff. You've heard Eric Adams now, who's like, hey, I'm back. Come back to me, everybody. Red Rover, come back to Adams. And all these establishment figures who became disenchanted with Eric Adams for his various scandals and federal criminal indictments, went to Cuomo and he's like, all right, you can come back to me now. And, his whole thing was like, Cuomo runs away from his record. Mamdani has no record because he's like 33 and done nothing. Come to the Eric Adams record, And so he wants to run on that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing polls here to see what the split is. You got, again, Sliwa with his beret and the cats on the Republican side. He probably gets about 20-something%. Then you got Eric Adams. It'll be very interesting to see sort of where the polling is there. And then you have Mamdani. He probably has a good core of support, right? 30-something% of New Yorkers. He also brought out a bunch of first-time voters. And so that's very interesting to see. A bunch of young voters, was seeing a bunch of his supporters at the rally. It's a young crowd. It's a Gen Z crowd voting for a 33-year-old. I mean, he was born in 1991. And so it'll be very interesting to see, but he has this appeal. And I will say that there's something similar about him and AOC. And I'll even throw Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, regardless of your politics, there's an authenticity that people are demanding of their candidates. And the Cuomo, Pelosi, Schumer, whatever world of triangulation and trying to please everybody doesn't play these days, especially among Gen Zers. Where like, just be real with me. I might disagree with you, but like, I just want you to like tell me what you believe and, not try to suck up to me in any way.
Right. Kamala Harris, who of course ran against Trump in the general election, Trump was trying to call her a communist, a socialist, and she ran away from it. Whereas Mamdani is just like, yeah, that's right. That's what I am.
I'm a proud democratic socialist. Like, I think that's great. Sweden's democratic socialist. Finland's democratic socialist. Like, I think they have great ideas there. And so ultimately he's embraced it. And by the way, that is really exciting for Republicans.
Well, that's right. So President Trump responding to Mamdani's win, writing on X, quote, "It has finally happened. The Democrats have crossed the line. Zohran Mamdani, a 100% communist lunatic, just won the Democratic primary and is on his way to becoming mayor. We've had radical lefties before, but this is getting a little ridiculous." He does go on a bit longer than that.
Yeah, he sent multiple posts, and I imagine by the time we wake up this morning, there'll be even more. This is the dream for Donald Trump. Next year, they have midterm elections, and Republicans will struggle, if you look at historical trend lines, to maintain the House. Well, now you have the potential that they will literally have somebody who is a proud democratic socialist as the mayor of the biggest city in America, and they get to say, hey, you're going to let the Democrats in here? They're a bunch of socialists. And I imagine you'll probably see a few others, potentially win their primaries and in various congressional races, potentially. And so what does that mean? Well, Republicans are going to repeat this. I bet he's going to be talking about Mamdani every week for the next year and a half. And I bet that if Mamdani wins, he will conduct ICE raids and see if Mamdani will, how he's going to work with the NYPD. So you're going to see like LA, what you saw in LA a couple of weeks ago, you can see that times 10. That's what Trump is going to want to do. Trump is a New Yorker. Trump's from Queens. Trump Tower, etc. Like this will be like one of the central political narratives of 2026. I mean, we're going to talk about it in 2025, but in particular 2026 because you've got midterm elections. So, you're going to have Democrats awkwardly dancing around Mamdani. Mamdani's views are far to the left of the mainstream of the Democratic leadership. Chuck Schumer and these other folks are like, congratulations to Zohran. He ran a good race. It's literally the only thing they could say about him. And they realize that they have a problem with constituents who want them to fight, right? And so, how many of them will get knocked out? To what extent do they have to embrace him, but not embrace him too much? This awkward dance they'll have to do with Mamdani. Remember, New York City mayors are particularly influential. The last three ran for president, named Rudy Giuliani, Mike Bloomberg, Bill de Blasio. It's the center of the media. And so New York City mayors kind of punch above the weight. 9 million constituents, world financial capital, $120 billion budget. And so, it's no joke, that job. And we're going to watch how this race unfolds these next few months. The conference calls, happening between various financial leaders and influential folks inside New York. How do we prevent this disaster from happening in New York? And, you do have I've heard from people, Jill, in the Jewish community, the largest population of Jews outside of Israel is in New York City, more than 1 million. We're really concerned about his views. And, you mentioned his sort of background as a pro-Palestinian activist and his various views. That he doesn't want to use the NYPD to help the feds take out undocumented migrants in the city. But he said, he will use the NYPD to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu for the warrant that he has with the International Criminal Court, even though the U.S. is not part of the International Criminal Court. And so there's views, concerned within the Jewish community about what that means. Now, I should mention the New York City mayor has no foreign policy relevance, right? Doesn't impact things, but certainly his views eventually could impact how protests are handled in the city. And, we are at a time of record high anti-Semitic attacks in New York City. And so ultimately, that's going to be one of the many storylines that you see unfolding here out of New York. And lucky for all of you, I live here in New York City, so I'll be here to I'll be your eyes and ears on the ground here as to what's going on. I actually live a few blocks away from Gracie Mansion, so maybe we'll have some fun anecdotes.
Moshe, if anyone out there is like us and cannot get enough of this political conversation, there's plenty more of it. You had a really fascinating convo with Tara Palmieri of Red Letter. She's covered New York City politics for years. That conversation was on Substack, but we're going to put it out on the Mo News Premium podcast this morning. Okay, in other news, President Trump says that the U.S. and Iran will meet for talks next week for a potential nuclear deal. For now, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding. Tehran, by the way, insisting it will not give up its nuclear program, also not confirming these talks that Trump says are going to happen next week. Its parliament on Wednesday actually agreed to fast-track a proposal that would effectively stop the country's cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which is the UN watchdog that has been monitoring the program for years. The IAEA says it had written to Iran to discuss resuming inspections of their nuclear facilities. Among other things, Iran claims to have moved its highly enriched uranium ahead of the U.S. strikes. So the IAEA wants its inspectors to get back on the ground to reassess the country's stockpiles. A reporter asking President Trump whether he would strike Iran again if it were to rebuild its nuclear facilities. He answered in one word, Moshe, sure.
Yeah, he views this whole thing as done and dusted as far as concerned. He's like, there's no way. I don't even need to make an agreement with the Iranians because we eliminated their program and they would not dare do this again. Now, I should note, as you mentioned, the Iranian parliament, which is basically a joke, the Supreme Leader, they do whatever the Supreme Leader wants, voted to stop cooperation there. And then they went into their normal shtick there where they all got together in the center of the floor and shouted death to Israel, death to America for a few minutes there. We put up the clip on Instagram. It's a tradition going back 46 years. It's like saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Good morning, death to Israel, death to America. They actually have the flags on the ground. They walk on them in the entryway of various government buildings there in Iran. So the Iranians, playing strong here, saying, oh, they eliminated nothing. Donald Trump, meanwhile, being like, no, we did some destruction to your program. He really doesn't like the fact that these headlines are out there. He's been really going off on these headlines that there's this one intel assessment early. It only covered the first day after the attack with satellite pictures. This is a low confidence intel estimate that the U.S. didn't do too much damage. But again, there's 18 intelligence agencies. It typically takes months, and no one can even get to the sites right now to figure out what exactly happened. But Trump has been trying to make a point over and over again. It's really annoying him, this intel report that said, he didn't accomplish that much on Saturday night. And so there will actually apparently be a great briefing today by Pete Hegseth, at least promised briefing, with more details on how much was destroyed. Now, keep in mind, too, the Israelis are doing their own estimates, and in some cases, the Israelis do not share intel with the Americans. And they sometimes share it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the Americans share with Israel, sometimes they don't. And the Israelis are very plugged in, as we found out, in what's happening in Iran. So they're doing their own assessments, and so far the Israelis have been saying, no, we set their program years back. And again, they're also saying Iran wouldn't dare try to build this program again, and if they do, we'll bomb them again. So you're hearing that from both Trump and them. Jill, it's interesting. This is all happening at NATO, the meeting at The Hague. And Trump was very sort of nonchalant. We may sign an agreement. We may not. I'm going to ask Marco Rubio if he wants to make a deal with the Iranians. We don't need a deal because they would never do this again. And, as Trump said yesterday, we destroyed the nuclear. It's blown up. The kingdom come. So I don't feel strongly about it. We're going to meet them. Actually, we're going to meet with them. So that's what he said so far. And so it's interesting in all of that. He did this face-to-face with the head of NATO, the Secretary General, where they talked to the media briefly. And Trump likened the war between Israel and Iran to a schoolyard brawl. Take a listen.
They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easy to stop them.
Now, the response was probably the thing that probably got our most attention yesterday, Jill, because the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, is a former Dutch leader, and now he runs NATO. He then said to Trump, "Daddy has to sometimes use strong language." He was referring to Trump as daddy. It caught people sort of off guard.
Even Trump, it felt like. He was like,
so apparently he was making a reference to the F-bomb that Trump dropped the day before. They used strong language. And so the NATO Secretary General was like, daddy has to sometimes use strong language. But it was weird. Two grown men, one guy referring to the other one as daddy. Maybe there's something lost in the translation.
Okay, time for the speed read from Axios. HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy's newly appointed Vaccine Advisory Board will review the federal childhood vaccination schedule and make recommendations on measles and hepatitis B shots. This is according to the panel's chair. Changes to the schedule could limit access to certain immunizations, since recommendations from that advisory committee on immunization practices influence insurance coverage decisions and also what physicians tell patients. Martin Koldorf is one of the people running the committee. He is a biostatistician. He was fired from Mass General after refusing a COVID vaccine. He said the commission will look into the cumulative effect of current U.S. childhood and adolescent vaccine schedules. Questions may include whether a hepatitis B vaccine should be recommended for all newborns, as well as the optimal time for administering the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, or the MMR vaccine. Also, possible exemptions from the shot on religious grounds.
So this full vaccine recommendation panel actually had their first meeting since Kennedy fired the previous 14 commissioners. He fired them fell swoop. We haven't seen that before. But he said, these guys are totally corrupt and in the pocket of pharma, et cetera. So he brought in his own people. That's been questioned, including by some Republicans on Capitol Hill, the decision there. So they've begun their meeting. They're scrutinizing right now the way the CDC has designed its studies in the past, analyzing data, skeptical of mRNA technology, which has been highly touted in recent years, including for that COVID vaccine, but now for uses for other vaccines. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics and some other organizations did not participate in Wednesday's meeting. Medical associations are typically included with this vaccine recommendation group as non-voting representatives. The American Academy of Pediatrics saying, we won't lend our name or our expertise to a system that is being politicized at the expense of children's health. So you do see the medical community, public health community, very skeptical, very concerned about the various moves that Kennedy is making within HHS right now.
To some business news in the battle to be the biggest company in the world. From CNBC, Nvidia shares rose more than 4% Wednesday and closed at a record for the first time since January. Nvidia now worth $3.77 trillion, making it the largest company in the world by market cap, slightly beating out Microsoft, which is one of its main customers. Apple is third at about $3 trillion. Nvidia is the leader in graphics processing units, or GPUs. They are used to build large language models and run AI workloads. But the strength of this year's rally, pretty surprising, given that the company has said that it is locked out of the Chinese market, which is, of course, the second biggest economy in the world.
Nvidia surging. I mean, from if you bought some Nvidia stock a few years ago, Jill, we'd both be very rich people. But just because of the incredible percentage growth that the stock has seen as AI has boomed and how core they are to AI. So they're looking at incredible growth right now in revenue. We're talking about their earnings report, 69% increase in year-over-year revenue. For the full fiscal year, they're expecting similar to that. Hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue growth. They held their shareholder meeting yesterday and said that beyond AI, robotics is also big for them. So Nvidia really at the center of a lot of what's happening with technology.
From The Economist, an interesting trend line in several Western countries. The drop in people leaving religion has paused and has actually reversed from 2019 to 2024. So in 1990, only about 5% of Americans said that they were atheists, agnostics, or believed in, quote, nothing in particular. And by 2019, about 30% ticked those boxes. Those who left the pews became more socially liberal, married later, and had fewer children. Churches, where once half of Americans mingled every Sunday, really faded in civic life. Yet, for the first time in half a century, the march of secularism has stopped. And this is true elsewhere, like in Canada, Britain, and France. So the most plausible explanation for the changing trend is the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdown, social isolation, economic shocks affected almost all countries and age cohorts at about the same time that the data on religious belief hit an inflection point. This is especially the case for Gen Z, whose years of early adulthood were disrupted, leaving many young people lonely or depressed and looking for meaning. But the numbers show the trend has persisted beyond the pandemic. Across 3 surveys in 2023 to 2024, the share of young Americans identifying as Christian rose from 45% to 51%, and the nuns, as in NONES, not NUNS, fell by 4 points to 41%.
Yeah, so in all 14 Western countries surveyed by Pew here, which did the polling, more people, often twice as many, said their faith was strengthened by the pandemic rather than weakened. Research shows internet searches for prayer and other religious practices shot up in almost every country in 2020. And since then, and there's an interesting gender divide here. Young men in particular are more keen on God here, overturning a norm that spans now cultures and time, that women were the more devout sex here. In America, Gen Z women are now more likely to have no religious affiliation than their male peers, as according to a separate study from the group AEI. Joe, you see this playing out in politics too, Gen Z women being more liberal than we've ever seen, and Gen Z men becoming more conservative. So that seems to go in line here with religious affiliation as well. Jill, I don't know that I find any of this that surprising. Religion for millennia, for centuries, has given people meaning in things. And we live in this world of technology and fast-moving things. And people are, looking for, some basic meaning for what's happening around them. Things are moving very quickly. It feels like there's crisis all the time. So, there is this return to faith, at least by some, but it is interesting. You sort of see the march towards secularism halted in a number of countries, and then you see a slight reversal in a few countries as well. France, for example, is seeing a rise in adult baptisms, and very much secular culture in Europe has been a thing for a very long time. We are always seen in the U.S. among Western countries as more religious than the folks in Europe, especially in sort of recent decades. So that's an interesting trend line to be watching.
And finally, from the New York Times, who wants a Blackberry?
I do.
Well, Moshe, apparently you're going to be fighting off some Gen Zers. All over TikTok, young people are romanticizing the era of the Blackberry, despite the fact that many of them weren't even old enough to have a phone.
Is this like how folks like boomers felt when, like, in the 90s, we wanted to bring back like bell bottoms and tie-dye and stuff?
I think it's more like record players, like vinyl records.
Yeah. Like, oh, an 8-track is so cool.
And so you're like, wait a minute, I can't just download that or play what I want on demand.
This is a very inconvenient way to play music, yeah.
So this is part of a larger trend in which people are posting and sharing videos of what they call nostalgia tech. They miss the tactile keyboard, they say, also the smooth feel of the track bell.
Well, they can't miss something they weren't alive for, Jill.
Moshe, you make a great point. I didn't say the story made any sense. But what they really seem to miss, according to the New York Times, which went through a ton of these videos, is a simpler time when people's entire lives didn't exist inside of their phones, which at that point were gadgets like a portable CD player or a Game Boy. It's when phones were really just meant to communicate with people.
Yeah. There was a time where you weren't constantly tracked, and the phones, like, you weren't constantly staring at your phone because your phone didn't do much. It made phone calls. Maybe you could text message somebody. You had to pay like 10 cents. I remember like early on, I had to pay like 10 cents a text message, or the data would be done by like the 8th of the month. And I'm like, oh, no more text messages for the rest of the month. Guys, this existed. And this time wasn't so long ago. It's like the year 2004. Anyway, so apparently there's a lot of folks on TikTok I'm sure the folks at Research in Motion are like, where have you guys been? Because we got our, butt handed to us by Apple in the early teens there. And we were talking about that at the top of the podcast, that ultimately they're like, how could you, have a phone without a keyboard? That's going to be so weird. There's a famous Steve Ballmer clip. Steve Ballmer took over Microsoft after Bill Gates, who's like, this thing will never work. It's a famous NBC clip. We've posted on Instagram a few times. Like, that's ridiculous. It doesn't even have a keyboard. This iPhone thing is going to be a joke. And it wasn't a joke, right? And so there we have it. We'll see. We have seen a number of Gen Zers adopt flip phones. There's certainly a lot of parents now who don't want their kids to have smartphones or are giving their kids flip phones. And so maybe the, flip phone and the Blackberry, which doesn't really have, at least for a while, they didn't really have apps. Then they tried to compete and have apps. So interesting kind of, besides the keyboard, like what the appeal of the Blackberry is, besides just a nostalgia play.
Landlines apparently also making a comeback, or at least people are posting about landlines making a comeback.
What about dial-up modems?
But Moshe, one of my favorite videos or clips that will make its rounds on social media every once in a while, I'll see it, is like, don't mess with Gen X. We were the generation that if we wanted to talk to our friends, we actually had to call via a landline and talk to their parents and ask to speak.
By the way, elder millennials like me, we had to do the same thing. This is like, takes you to the mid-90s when a cell phone's still expensive. You had to call the parents. Hey, is blah, blah, blah home? They had to have like a conversation with the parents. And then the internet that day, like you'd be using the phone line for the internet. So then you couldn't get through on the home phone line. It was busy. They're like, oh, they must be using the internet right now.
Or you'd be on the phone and like your brother could pick up and listen in. It was just
I need
such
to order
a
a pizza.
weird culture.
Get off the phone. I need to use the phone.
Anyway, Moshe,
that was a big
leads us.
thing. But I remember, kids saying, I got my own line. We got a second line to the house, so I don't have to use my parents' line.
A walk down memory lane, which actually brings us very nicely to On This Day in History.
Nice segue there, Jill. Yes, on this day in history, the UN Charter was formally signed on this day, June 26, 1945, in San Francisco. The UN, established after World War II in an attempt to maintain international peace. It had some influence for a few decades there, but the UN really sort of a joke now. It's a democratic institution, and when there's more authoritarian regimes than democracies, that's where you're at. So the UN, sort of a group that talks now, but doesn't have much in the way of influence over global peace, though they are engaged in a lot of humanitarian efforts around the world. On this day in 1963, the JFK clue from earlier, some of you might know this, but there's this famous speech that he gave in Berlin on this day in history. Let's play a clip.
As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
So he declared there, Jill, Ich bin ein Berliner. What he thought he was saying, I'm a Berliner, like you. I live in Berlin. At that time, Berlin was divided between communism, between Soviet occupation, and the West. Apparently, the proper way to say I'm a Berliner is Ich bin Berliner. Ich bin ein Berliner means I'm a Berliner donut. Ich bin ein Berliner, like there's apparently a type of donut. So he technically said he's a donut. But we'll give, JFK was, we know what he meant.
I think they knew what he meant, but I'm sure they were just
cheered
like,
and whatever, but like, it's a fun thing I learned a while back. All right. Another piece of history for you on this day in history. 51 years ago today, a supermarket in Troy, Ohio sold a 10-pack of Juicy Fruit. Not that significant, Juicy Fruit gum. What made it significant, though, it was the first product to ever be scanned and purchased using a UPC barcode. The barcode made its debut today at a supermarket in Ohio, and they wanted to make checkout more efficient by, having scan technology. Companies were protesting initially. They didn't like this idea. Eventually, it was adopted, and now everything, gets scanned. And as for why the first ever item was scanned there, a shop, they didn't think the technology would work, so they wanted to start with something very small. So that's why they start with a pack of gum.
The irony is that you would think that they'd start with something bigger because it's a code, like it's a barcode. So on a pack of gum, it would have to be really small.
And I think that was what they were testing. They're just like, let's see.
If it could work on this.
Let's see if it could work on the back of gum. It could work on anything. On this day in 1990, a key moment in presidential history, President George H.W. Bush the father, goes back on his no new taxes pledge in the election in 88. He had said, Read my lips, no new taxes. 2 years later, he conceded that budget-wise, he needed to increase taxes. That didn't work out very well for him. And so ultimately, one of the reasons he would lose in 92 to Bill Clinton was the whole read my lips, no new taxes. And so since then, no one has uttered that phrase, that infamous phrase.
Moshe, I still remember those commercials because it was that phrase juxtaposed by 2 years later, George
2 years
Bush instituted the biggest tax increase.
Vote Bill Clinton, 1992. This ad paid for by the Clinton campaign. And we'll end here with book history. We normally do music and movies, but big book history on this day in history. 28 years ago today, the first Harry Potter novel was released by J.K. Rowling. It was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It would later have the title Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It was the first of a number of Harry Potter books there, movies, multi-billion-dollar franchise. You've heard of it.
I was about to go down.
You've probably heard of Harry Potter.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. The reviews help.
Have a great Friday Eve, everybody, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.